Welcome to part 2 of the German Historical Institute's Text Mining for Historians course with Dr. Luke Blaxell of the University of Oxford and Dr. Caspar Bielen of the Turing Institute. In this unit we're going to be looking at data and corpus creation, selecting textual data, collecting it and structuring it for your analysis. So this second class is all about data, and by this we of course mean textual data for the purposes of building a corpus and structuring it. First, we're going to be talking about how we can select our textual data for the corpus. In other words, what we put in, what we leave out. Then we're going to talk about actually collecting the data using online repositories, optical character recognition, Twitter and web scraping to be able to actually collect the data for the corpus. After having collected the data, we're then going to talk about how we can structure it so we can actually analyse it to tell us interesting historical things. And by this we mean adding metadata. Now, when we start thinking about building a corpus for textual analysis, the first stage is to think about the selection of texts. Now, unsurprisingly, the results that are harvested from any corpus will only be as good as the data that is put in to the corpus. And by good data, I mean data that has a claim to be able to represent a particular historical subject of interest. Data which can be meaningfully compared with other data, data which is clean and accurately machine readable, and data which is well documented and explicit. That is to say, it is clear what has been put in and what has been left out. Like with all historical analysis, we begin with a research question, which is to say, what are you interested in using text mining to find out? Text mining excels when it comes to questions of quantity. How many times did particular groups mention certain things? To what extent was language predominant prior to an event and after it? What about the language of one place versus another, or one group versus another? What about language that is associated with a particular term? For example, the term liberal or the term woman. But this just gives you very much an introductory flavour, and it will become obvious what research questions text mining is a very powerful tool to analyse, and what research questions that text mining is much less useful to analyse. But for now, let's just start with a research question and also an analysis of what kind of texts there are that we can analyse through text mining to shed some light on that research question. As I just mentioned, text mining of all forms thrives upon comparisons. One group versus another, one time period versus another, one place versus another, or indeed anything where you can think that there are two language groups that you would like to compare for historical analysis. Now, this selection stage is the blue skies part of building a corpus. We really have to ask ourselves whether there is textual data for the whole of the area of interest that we are interested in. For example, is there text that represents the whole of a historical time frame, for example, 30 years? Is there textual data that represents the whole of a geography of interest, the whole of a group of interest? If there isn't, the question is really whether the parts of that larger whole, be it a group, be it a geographical area, be it a time frame, whether there is enough of interest within that subset for you to be able to still ask interesting research questions if you've got text which represents only some of your historical area of interest, but not all of it. Note that, of course, a lot of this will simply be about the availability of texts, but it might be the case that the availability of text is contingent upon what the archive actually holds and what you can get hold of in digital form, which we'll have a look at when we talk about collecting the text in just a moment. But it also simply might be that your historical area of interest, you don't find as many texts for one period of time, or one group, or one geography as you would another. And those will be, I suppose, implicit issues within the fundamental starting point of your historical source base. So the question is really whether, for example, you have text available for the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party, but not for the Labour Party, whether it is still useful and productive to perform a text mining analysis. So the final question when it comes to selecting texts, we're assuming we've got a research question in mind, we're assuming we've got a comparison we want to make, and we're assuming that we've got some texts that we can analyse, is the question of biases in our textual selection. Now, quite clearly, if there are groups that are overrepresented within the corpus, if there are groups that are put in and others left out, then that is going to be an implicit potential weakness with the corpus that we have assembled. For example, it might be the case that if you're assembling a corpus of working class writers, for example, in Lancashire versus Yorkshire, that it might be the case that there are not very many women writers in that corpus. And so thus, the results that are harvested from this corpus will be reflective of male working class writers to a greater extent than they will be reflective of working class writers per se. And the question then is do you want to try and mitigate those biases in your select collection, maybe by expanding the geographical range of your corpus, being a bit more pragmatic on other things that you bring in order to be able to mitigate that potential weakness? Or do you just accept the weakness of the corpus and simply build that into your historical analysis from it, accepting the fact that your samples of some groups might be smaller than another, and putting that in as a caveat in your historical analysis in the actual text that you write? It's obviously the case that the historical record is patchy. Some things are archived, some things are not, and very rarely do we get to work with absolutely perfect data. But the biases within a corpus composition are exactly the same. There is exactly the same historical issue as the biases that exist within any historical archive. Who selected the texts that were put there? How the texts are organised? All of these questions are exactly the same with corpus composition as they are when it comes to the composition of any historical archive. Right, so assuming that we've selected some texts for analysis, the next stage is actually collecting them, actually getting hold of them so that we can analyse them. Now, of course, at this point, a lot of pragmatism is probably going to creep in, simply because it is not possible to get all of the texts that we might want for a variety of reasons. These can include the physical difficulty actually of obtaining it, the fact that the texts perhaps don't exist in the volume that you might expect, or in some cases because of copyright law. So, the obvious first place to start when it comes to building a corpus is to look at online textual repositories. One of the great boons of doing this analysis in the 2020s is that there is a vast plethora of textual, publicly available historical information available in machine-readable form. The 19th and 20th centuries in particular were, of course, the ages of text, and there are hundreds of millions of words of such texts available online. So, to give examples of some online repositories that may be of use to you, depending, of course, on your research question. Well, there are various newspaper archives. There is the British Newspaper Archive, or the BNA, which has vast digitizations of the provincial press in the 19th and 20th century in Britain. There is the New York Times Archive, there is the Times Digital Archive, the Guardian Digital Archive, the Daily Mail Digital Archive. Newspapers, because they represent a weekly or in many cases daily set of text which applies to a particular locality, are amongst the most conducive sources for text mining analysis, and we've got some example readings of those below. But of course, there are many other textual sources as well. Project Gutenberg has got a very wide range of books of all kinds, particularly published in the 19th century. You have the British Library Books Corpus, data.bl.uk, which consists of 19th century printed books and many other things. There's the early English books online, 1473 to 1700 corpus. There is the British National Corpus, which captures all kinds of texts. There is also the Google Books corpus, which is digitized around 20 to 25% of all texts ever written in the English language from 1800 onwards. But of course, to some degree, it is potluck, which is to say that it might be that the subject of historical study that you're interested in, be it political speeches, medical officer of health reports, or 19th century novels, is available in digital form, and you can download it and start assembling a corpus. But of course, it may be that what you are interested in, even though it may exist in textual form, hasn't been digitized yet. Now, in that case, there are the questions of how you can actually turn this into a machine-readable text if you have not been fortunate enough to be able to acquire it in a digital form. There are two, I think, important additional ways in which you can textualize the textual data, i.e. make it machine-readable. There's one which probably will not apply for most historians because obviously we tend to be interested in past textual data, but it might apply for some historians of very recent times, and that is web scraping and Twitter scraping. This is to say that you can use certain interfaces, certain code, to be able to download textual data en masse from websites. For example, the BBC News site, since it was launched in the late 1990s, and as is very popular in the social and political sciences, Twitter scraping. For example, trying to scrape and obtain all tweets from certain time periods and certain tweets with particular hashtags, etc. But perhaps of more relevance to historians is obtaining textual data yourself from historical sources using optical character recognition OCRing techniques. Now, there are a number of pieces of software such as Transcribus or Abbey Fine Reader which are able to read scanned images of texts and turn them into machine-readable text. Now, of course, this is not a precise process. Computers do make mistakes, especially when the text in question is of dubious quality. This can happen, for example, with print that is smudged or hard to read, or paper that is cracked in poor condition. Of course, with handwriting, it is a much more difficult process for computers to be able to read that accurately, although there are a number of things that you can do, even if it is post-optical character recognition filters, for example, to improve the quality of OCRing from these sources. And we've got some readings about OCR, which is in and of itself a massive area in the reading list below. But pragmatically, operationally, I would say, having digitized several million words of often poor quality old newsprint, that it is possible to digitize your own text. It is a question of obtaining high quality images in JPEG format or TIFF format from the historical source itself. And this can mean photocopies, scanning them into a computer, microfilm printouts, scanning them into a computer, obtaining high-quality digital images via library copying services. Of course, if you are going to do this, having a good quality scanner can be very helpful, and also a program such as Adobe Photoshop to be able to fiddle with the brightness and contrast levels so the text is as clear as you can make it. Those things will improve the quality of optical character recognition. The easier it is to read for a human eye, the easier it will be for a machine eye to read it also. Finally, I should say that there is the old-fashioned technique of obtaining a machine-readable corpus from the source, which was used before optical character recognition, and often when optical character recognition was not very accurate, which is so-called double rekeying. It is possible to pay for agencies to double rekey source materials from the actual source itself, thus giving you a machine-readable corpus. But of course, it can be expensive. I should finally say, in terms of the collecting of texts, that there are two other important things to consider. The first, and this will only really apply to historians who are working in the 20th century, is copyright law. Now, the UK has very strict copyright laws, that is to say, the digitization and analysis of texts. Usually, the rule is 70 years after the death of the writer. This can sometimes present complications as far as the publication, or indeed even the digitization of these sources are concerned. It is very much an active bone of contention in the UK digital humanities circles just how restrictive our copyright laws are in comparison, for example, to a country like the Netherlands. The final question is really, how much text do you actually need? So very often, corpus linguistics and text mining techniques will be trailed as the mass analysis of millions or hundreds of millions of words of textual data. And of course, corpus linguistics and text mining can very much be those things. But it is also possible to work with much smaller historical data. In my own work, comparing the language of political parties in the late 19th and early 20th century, I used comparative groups of only around 50,000 words, but they were very carefully selected. Which is to say that in order to represent the region of East Anglia, I had sampled groups of text from each of the 20 parliamentary constituencies in East Anglia and equal amounts of text for the Liberal and Conservative parties. Thus, in the same way as an opinion poll of 1,000 people can give a strong claim to accurately represent the views of an entire nation, so too can a well-selected, relatively small corpus. There isn't really a hard rule of thumb, but I would have certainly said that at the minimum you require texts in the tens of thousands of words to be able to make fruitful corpus comparisons. But it is not compulsory to have texts in the millions or even in the hundreds of thousands to be able to say very interesting things in history with text mining. So after we've selected the texts and then collected them, the third question when it comes to building a corpus is how we actually structure that corpus. Now this will all depend on something called metadata, which is essentially data about data. In this sense, what we want to do is to use the metadata to be able to make comparisons in the text, as I explained earlier. It may be the case that what you have downloaded or obtained has metadata in it already, which is to say that if you've downloaded 2 years worth of newspaper articles from the British Newspaper Archive, you are going to have in the file names 1880 versus 1881. You may have scanned articles from 2 different periodicals. In that respect, you have got the metadata of the periodical implicit in the data images that you have collected. It may likely be that as well as by time, your historical data will also be divided up, perhaps according to something else, such as the author, such as a geography, such as the group. Any of these things can be used to divide the data into groups. In other words, you are adding your own data to the data that already exists. Now, I should say that metadata is not just simply a fancy name for historical text files which have been sliced into different comparative groups. Metadata can also exist within the text itself. That is to say, electronic tags can be added to certain words. This is often called markup, for example, with the popular markup language XML. For example, it may be useful to be able to identify unique individuals within a textual corpus. This may not be so simple as searching for their name. For example, Lord Derby in a corpus of parliamentary debates will refer in different time periods to the 13th, 14th or 15th Earl of Derby, and so it can be very helpful to have these respective Earls of Derby marked up. So for example, if I want to find only the speeches or references to the 15th one, I'm able to do so. Likewise with places. If we find the word Boston in the text, does that refer to Boston in Lincolnshire or Boston in Massachusetts? Now, this markup can be of this factual kind, but it can also involve an element of judgment. For example, to continue with this politics example, if we are encoding political parties in the 19th century, it can sometimes be ambiguous whether a member actually sat for the Tories or the Whigs, or the Liberals or the Conservatives. But it can still be very useful for a historian to be able to aggregate all of the Conservative speeches or all of the Liberal speeches. And so that's where there is a balance to be struck between marking up particular things in the historical text, which requires the judgment of the coder, but also the potential for ambiguity, as there will always be when there is any classification involving a judgment that it is involved in any quantitative analysis in history of any kind, as for example the works of quantitative social historians like Charles Tilly remind us. Now, of course, this textual markup can be done in an automated way, or it can be done literally through a trained coder looking at the text and making a judgment of which group to put these words that should have these metadata in. I should hasten to say that XML markup within text is something which is obviously a lot more involved. It allows more multivariate and complex analysis. For example, with our own analysis of women in Parliament, we use this markup to be able to differentiate the speeches of male MPs versus female MPs, ministers versus backbenchers, Labour versus Conservative, all variables that it's very important we control for in our analysis. This being said, as I said, it is not necessary to put in this form of metadata. You can get a very long way simply by building different text files of one group versus another, one time period versus another, and feeding them into software and making comparisons. I should end by simply reflecting briefly on different kinds of data structures. Now, the first kind of data is structured data, which mostly refers to tabular data in which the values of all columns are standardized according to a specific data model. For example, each cell in a date field could conform to the format year, month, and day. And further, these fields could appear in the same format in multiple entries of these tables. Next, unstructured data is data that doesn't adhere to any data model. For example, text is just a sequence of characters and contains no other information. Finally, there's semi-structured data, which is a combination of structured and unstructured data. Some parts of the document might follow a data model, whereas others might not. For example, in parliamentary data, the date field, the speaker ID, or the sequence of speeches might be structured, but the actual text of the speech might be unstructured. Now, the reason that the degree of structure in your data can matter is that if you have semi-structured data or structured data, it's possible to program text analysis to recognize some of those structured elements. So, for example, you could take place names and compare them against each other. Take tweets made at certain times and compare them against tweets sent at other times. It just gives you a few more extra levers to pull when you are making analysis. This being said, I think the majority of data, textual data, that appears in the field of history is likely to be unstructured, and we can still do lots of very interesting things with what are likely to be humble TXT files.